So, once again, good afternoon. My name is Henk Sinkstra and I'm the chair of the Management Expert Group of Eurosite. And our aim is to transfer knowledge about site management and nature restoration. And we do that, among others, by organizing webinars, but also study tours. And also we are working on a management toolkit where information about various topics related to site management can be found. This is still work in progress. Today we speak about the protection and management of grassland habitats. About 1/3 of EU priority habitat types have co-evolved with extensive livestock systems over thousands of years, and their conservation depends on a continuation of these extensive farming methods. However, little information is available on the spatial distribution of extensive farming methods and their link to these semi-natural habitats. What we know is that vast areas where extensive farming systems exist are being abandoned, and where this is the case, forest encroachment takes over. As a result, grassland habitats belong to the most endangered habitat types within the European Union. The European Environment Agency has commissioned the European Forum on Nature Conservation and Pastoralism to get more clarity on the relation between extensive farming and biodiversity. The research resulted in an estimated number of extensive livestock needed for nature conservation at EU level and in member states. In this webinar, information about the background and the results of this research will be presented. But we start with a short introduction of Jan-Erik Petersen. Jan-Erik works at the European Environment Agency, the agency that commissioned the research. And he has been involved in the aspects of agriculture, agri-environment, and nature conservation for a very long time already. He has also been the lead responsibility for the development of agri-environment indicators and other topics related to this agri-environment. A particular focus of Jan-Erik's work over the past 5 years has been EEA's contribution to EU processes on the development of biodiversity and ecosystem monitoring. And this covers all kinds of data, satellite data, statistical sources, citizen science, as well as other innovative methods. He also continues to manage EEA's work on high nature value farmland and extensive grazing. So Jan-Erik, may I give the floor to you?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to share our work briefly. I have a short presentation that I will now try to share. I hope you can see it.
Yes.
It now should go into slideshow. There we are. So, as you already said, Hank, we have an important connection between extensive grazing systems and EU nature targets. There is specific targets related to the Birds and Habitats Directive, but also the Nature Restoration Regulation and the EU biodiversity strategy in general. There is limited statistical and spatial information on extensive farming systems and the overlap with habitats or Natura 2000 areas. So to improve on that, we have commissioned work from 2021 to 2024 in cooperation with the EU Joint Research Center and research organizations. And we had an important consultancy support from EFNCP, but also from Wageningen and Barnsley Research. And we had two perspectives: review the link of extensive grazing and EU biodiversity objectives, and also help update our estimate of share of high nature value farmland across Europe. Just generally, we had up to the middle of the last century, we had a lot of extensive systems surviving, or in particular on the livestock system side. But of course, with the increasing availability of fertilizers, feedstuff from other continents, modern technology, etc., our livestock sector has changed just as much as other agriculture production systems, and landscapes like you see it on the left from the Carpathians in Central Europe are very rare. And in most cases we have, at least in Western Europe, we have very productive large-scale systems which have a limited nature value with sort of individual pieces of habitat surviving, some of which may be well managed, but many of which are often not properly managed any longer. And so we need to understand this dichotomy, and we want to really reduce the area share of the systems on the right and expand the area share of the systems on the left. And in this context, you know, we would also deal with other environmental pressures that are linked to farming, such as greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution, to some degree pesticide pollution, etc. And this slide just shows an ideal scenario how we should change our livestock sector, given greenhouse gas targets to which also farming has to contribute to. We really need to reduce our overall livestock populations, but we need to do that in a way that those that have the best environmental profile and the best biodiversity co-benefits are maintained or even expanded, and we should reduce the ones that are very intensive. And our focus on the extensive livestock systems linked to semi-natural grazing was really to fill a data gap that exists on that part of our livestock systems. And that's really all I wanted to say, and I look forward to Gwyn Jones presenting the details of our work and to the questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan-Erik. That gives the perspective, offers us the perspective in which the research has been carried out. So we continue, and we'll give the floor to Gwyn Jones. He works for the European Forum on Nature Conservation and Pastoralism, as I said already. But he is also a farmer, and you can even buy beef from him. So he is both a practitioner and has the required theoretical background. So he's the right person to give us an introduction into the findings of the research his organization has carried out. So Gwyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Henk. Let's see. Is that showing full screen?
Yep.
Thanks, Henk. Yes, thanks very, very much for the privilege of giving this talk this afternoon. I wouldn't call myself a farmer in front of farmers, but maybe in this group it's okay. Yeah, only in a small way. So yeah, I hope I will be able to set out to you the results of this work, or at least the background to the work and the methodology of the work. As Jan-Erik said, the work was commissioned by and funded by the EEA. And it's very much a work in progress. So there's still data that we're checking, some data that we know We need to improve. We are improving them just now. And so even in the slides I show, I wouldn't take any of the values to be the final value. There'll be work coming out in the next weeks and months, which we hope you can treat as a preliminary interim value. But we really would encourage people to comment, especially detailed comments based on knowledge, based on local knowledge. That would be exactly what's needed, really. Sometimes I feel, like this imposter syndrome, but then the work needs to be done, and at present we're the ones doing it. And not that it can't be done better by other people, but it does need to be done. And somebody, if people feel they can take it forward, then we would really encourage that. So the work has policy relevance, and the policy relevance, if anything, has grown in the last few years because of the nature restoration regulation. So I'm very cognizant that we're speaking today in Eurosite, but the work, of course, reflects the importance of these habitats, not just in sites, in designated areas, but in the wider countryside. And it reflects on the history of the forum itself. The forum itself was saying, well, okay, nature isn't something separate from agriculture everywhere. And agriculture isn't negative to nature everywhere. There's a positive interaction that's possible, and that is actually important in large parts of Europe. And it's not just something that happens on designated areas, it's something that happens in the wider countryside. And policy, if it's serious, needs to recognize that. And potentially the nature restoration regulation has that outlook, perhaps more than the Habitats Directive itself originally had. As I was saying, nature isn't something that's separate from agriculture, and that's reflected in the Habitats Directive itself, in the list of habitats of community interest, which is Annex 1. And actually 61 of those Annex 1 habitats, at least 61, so our Greek colleagues during the process were saying to them, oh, these habitats also should be in the list, but at least 61 of the habitats need agricultural management, at least in some of the area of their distribution. This work was originally carried out by Osterman when it was a smaller EU, and then it was developed in 2011 by Ljubos Halada, and Jan Erik was part of that team. And we're now calling the list the Halada habitats, just as a shorthand. So they are very diverse. Henk introduced it saying that they were grasslands, and okay, European agricultural terminology tends to call everything grasslands, but of course they're not only just grasslands. In the Netherlands, they're not just grasslands. We have grasslands, of course, whether they're coastal grasslands or dry grasslands on limestone, limestone pavements, river meadows. But we also have other types of habitats. So we have heathlands, especially, of course, in Northern Europe and in mountainous Europe. And then in the Mediterranean, we have these sclerophyllous habitats, shrublands. And also we have habitats that are transitional between woodlands and open habitats. So these are wood meadows, for example, but wood pastures, dehesas, they're all on this list. So yeah, they're very diverse. I think also that we need to remind ourselves that they are actually species diverse within themselves. We often have this impression, I think, that agricultural habitats have some sort of poor relation, for example, to forest. But if you look at diversity of the number of species, I mean that type of diversity, at different scales, this is what this diagram shows. This is the area of the quadrat, if you like, along this one here, and the species richness. Okay, it is true, of course, that at a very large scale, forests have the diversity records in the world. This is for the world now. But at smaller scales, the record holders are grasslands. And these are most European grasslands, because a lot of work has been done in Europe, of course. And they're from a whole range of Europe. So there's machers in Scotland, there's wood meadows in Estonia, there's calcareous grasslands in the White Carpathians, there's wet grasslands in Romania. They're all on this list of record holders. So it's a diverse habitat potentially. It's also a habitat, it's also a range of habitats, these semi-natural habitats, that are the refuge of endemic species. So Ines Bruchmann, 10 years ago, roughly, did some work where they looked at endemics in Europe. And there's an issue with endemics in Europe, of course, because something can occur in Austria and Switzerland, and so it's not endemic anywhere. So they lumped them together, looking at the European scale. And what was quite interesting was that, okay, we have the most habitats in rocks and screes. So these are in islands of mountains. So we know that through island biogeography. But after that, the most important habitats for endemics were grasslands and scrub and heath. So these are the very semi-natural habitats that we're talking about here. So from all different perspectives, these habitats are very, very important for nature and biodiversity. Sadly, the state of them is not very good. Can I move this thing here? Yes, I can. The state of them is not very good. And in general, their state is worse than other habitats that are in the Annex 1. So this top bit is conservation status. The top line is these halida habitats, the fully dependent ones on agriculture. These are the ones that are partially dependent, and these are other habitats. And as you can see, a much higher proportion of the fully dependent habitats have bad conservation status. And then if we look at the bottom half of the page here, this is the trend that we see. And again, we see a similar sad picture that let me make my pointer a bit better. Where are we? Pointed. Okay. That the fully dependent habitats are more likely to be deteriorating than the other habitats, for example. So it's a very poor state of play. And it's especially a poor state of play, of course, in the context of 30 by 30 targets, for example. So we can't ignore them. These are very important parts of the European nature picture, which need to be, whose state needs to be much improved. So this is, we'll get back to the detail of the extent of them, but this is just some sort of breakdown here. So Henk is right, of course, that most of the habitats are in fact grasslands. So each color here is the area of a different habitat, at least an estimate of the area of the different habitats. But you can see there's significant areas of heath and scrub and bogs and sclerophyra. So together, they make almost as much of an area as grasslands, but not quite. And if we look at the totals, there's a lot of hum and ha to come in about it. We'll talk about that later. But it's roughly at least 35 million hectares, which is about the size of Germany. And that makes up between a fifth and a quarter of the EU's farmland area. Okay, there's an issue sometimes with what is farmland, but that's the rough proportion we're talking about here. So it's really quite a significant area. And if we're taking 30 by 30 seriously, then it has to be also taken seriously. The fate of these areas also has to be taken seriously. And that's beyond the commitments that are within the Habitat Directive and so on. So this study, what did we try and do? Well, we were asking ourselves a quite obvious, really, question, but one which doesn't seem to have been asked before. So if these halida habitats need agriculture, and agriculture, for the most part, means grazing, there are some mown habitats, but they are relatively few in number, so most of it means grazing. So if it needs livestock, how many livestock do we need? And so that's what we tried to do. We tried to estimate what the grazing need was for holiday habitats per habitat and per biogeographical region and per country. And then we lumped them all together to get totals. And the way we did that, of course, is by multiplying some sort of area estimate by some sort of grazing need estimate. And how we arrived at that is what I'll talk about in the next sections. But in broad terms, we have a source for the area, and that's the Article 17 reports that each member state has to produce periodically. But we didn't have an independent pre-existing source for the grazing need, and so we did that work by speaking to experts, asking them for their opinions. So to start with the area, you'll be aware that under Article 17 of the Habitats Directive, member states have to send in a periodic report. The article is longer than this, but this is the key part of it, that it has to do it every 6 years. And there's lots of things it has to report on, things about Natura sites and all that sort of thing. But amongst them is the area of habitat, the whole area of habitat, not just the area in Natura. So what member states do in response varies somewhat. It can vary by habitat within the report. Sometimes they give a best estimate, a single value. Sometimes they'll give a range, so they'll give a maximum and a minimum. And sometimes they'll give a maximum, minimum, and a best estimate. So it varies. But in general, we took those reports at face value, even though we know actually that some are wrong, and Romania is a case in point, as we'll show later. If member states did give a best value, then we used the best value. We didn't think we knew better than the member state, so we used that. So you'll see some graphs as we go on where we use the minimum and the best. In other words, if there was a best, we use the best and then the minimum. If there wasn't, and in other words, we use the best and the maximum. Okay, so but we always use the best if there was a best. We know in some cases that there's missing values. So Portugal, for example, lists the habitat it has, but has blank lines for some of them. So we had no way of filling that in. So we know that's an issue, but not a huge one, I don't think. It's mostly in Portugal. And then in some countries and for some habitats, we had a really large range between the maximum and minimum, which was quite glaring. And sometimes, that's a concern. And we'll talk a bit about that in a bit now. So here now is the minimum and best area for the habitats in EU member states, just to give you a rough idea of how that 35 million hectares breaks down. We have two issues here. We'll come back to those later. But if you look at the bulk of the picture, you'll see that Spain is really, really important. We don't think this is wrong. We think this is right. Spain is of vast importance for these habitats in Europe. But of course, there's a lot within other countries, and partly this reflects that Spain is also a large country, of course. This is Romania here. So it appears from this diagram that Romania has 8 million hectares of grasslands, Annex 1 grasslands, Halada grasslands. But when we look at agricultural statistics, Romania actually only declares 4.4 million hectares of permanent grassland. So there's something wrong somewhere. And in fact, if you add up all the habitats in Romania, not just the Halada ones, but woodlands and all that, then you get more than the total area of Romania. So there's something wrong somewhere. And our expert estimate is that there's roughly 1.2 million, so down here somewhere, hectares of Halada habitats in Romania, roughly. Sweden is a different case. So what we have in Sweden is a natural tree line in the boreal area. So there's large areas of, for example, boreal heaths or boreal grasslands, which otherwise might be managed by agriculture, but which in this case are not managed by agriculture, unless we're counting reindeer herding as agriculture, which is would be a rather a different way of looking at it. And so in Sweden, we know that there's it's not so much that the data is wrong; it's just how we deal with it. It has to be another issue. So that's roughly the picture. If we look at the maximum and the minimum estimates, what we see is this picture. So there's not too much of a difference between the maximum and minimum, actually, except for these two habitats here. And these two habitats are the meadow habitats, the lowland meadows and the upland meadows. And in fact, most of that range comes from France. France has a huge maximum estimate for lowland meadow. It's not for me to say why, but it's inexplicable, really. It's inexcusable, I would say, not speaking on behalf of the EA, obviously. And what we see is that actually there's very few habitats have over 10,000 hectares of variation between the maximum and minimum at the EU level. Here's the meadows here, the lowland meadows. You can see 12 million hectares of difference, and the mountain meadows, 2 million. Everything else is quite modest, actually. Not saying that there's no room for improvement, but it's rather modest. And in fact, most of the variation is in just 3 countries. So Croatia, it's a rather small variation, but it's compared to the size of Croatia, it's quite large. And Italy. And in Italy, the issue is mainly in the some alpine, but mostly southern habitats. Habitat quality, data quality seems to be better in the north. But again, it's France, really, that these glaring 2 figures for the lowland and mountain hay meadows. Figures which can surely be much improved. So to give just an overview of the habitat data then, habitat area data. Again, to make a EFNCP point rather than a EA point, it's really surprising, disgraceful, one might say, that there's such a large uncertainty on some of these habitats after so many rounds of reporting of Article 17. You know, France is one of the oldest member states. Romania's error is really obvious just by simple arithmetic. So it's really quite shocking, really, that things aren't being improved as time goes on. But having said all that, really, especially if we take out the French meadow data, the uncertainty is not that huge, really. So it is really likely that the habitats cover more than 35 million. It really is quite likely, because that's a minimum estimate for most countries that makes sense. So it could be maybe even 40 million, but it's in that sort of order. And one thing to say, I think, is that it seems such an important piece of information. I mean, it's been asked for in Article 17 reports for years, and now 30 by 30 is upon us. And that evidence is particularly relevant for that, isn't it? And yet, the impression we get is that the question is a kind of backwater, with, you know, which has just been neglected. It's a very strange, jarring disjunct, really, between what seems to be necessary and what seems to be actually being looked at. So that's just a political comment from my side, really. Okay, so that's the habitat area. What about the grazing needs? So what we did was ask experts from different countries where we could find them. So we knew some already. We had a lot of help from the European Dry Grasslands Group to find some more. But there were still gaps. France, for example, was a gap. We never got anybody from France. And of course, if you think about how many livestock you need, immediately ecologists say, oh, well, of course, it depends how long you graze for. If you graze for very intensively for a short period, or, extensively for a longer period, So we said to them, well, okay, the way to think of it is this. If you had 100 cattle, if you had 1,000 sheep or whatever, how many hectares could you manage in one season? And then work it out from that. And okay, we know that intensive for a short period and extensive for a long period is not quite the same. But in that way, we evened it out a bit, and that's what we asked them. We didn't consider the possibility of the same livestock going to different habitats. So if we went into the most fine detail, the most precision we possibly could, then at some point that would be an issue we'd have to think about. But at this broad scale, perfect is the enemy of the good, and we're happy enough with that. And the other thing to say, of course, is we're not saying this is the amount of livestock that are supported by these habitats. So maybe for half the year, they're not on these habitats. Maybe for the quarter of a year, they're not on these habitats. We're just saying that the habitats depend on them rather than the other way around, okay? And so we brought these together into biogeographical regions, first of all. And so we filled in from different countries to try and make as big a matrix, populate the matrix as much as we could from the experts. And then when there was gaps, we filled them ourselves. Fortunately, there wasn't too many gaps, but where we did it, we tried to look at the other regions and see if there was a pattern, and then tried to make one. So this is the top. What is this? The first third of the habitats. So as I was saying earlier, don't take these values to be the final ones. You're welcome to look at them. The presentation will be available, but don't use these as being the gospel. Anyway, so this is what we ended up with. These are the habitats here, of course. These are the biogeographical regions here at the top. And this is the range that expert gives us. Sometimes it was just a single value, but most often it was a range, and the range sometimes was, a variation of 2 times, but in some cases you can find some here, a variation of 10 times or a variation of 20 times even. So quite a large variation in some cases. And then the red ones are the ones where we interpreted. So you can see 0.1 there. It's between 0.03 and 0.15. So yeah. So that's just our guess. So it might be wrong, of course. It could be that we should have taken 0 as our inspiration, but that's what we do, and we invite people to knock them down and give better values. That's not a problem at all. Okay. All right. Just one thing to say. I use the word uncertainty because I'm not sure what other words to use. But it's not necessarily a reflection of the experts not knowing what the habitats needed. I don't mean it to imply that. In some cases, the experts are really fairly sure what the habitats need, but there's a large variation within the habitat type. There may be, for example, calcareous grasslands that are on very thin soils, and there may be calcareous grasslands that are on deeper soils, and that still come within the same habitat class in the directive. And so this isn't a reflection necessarily of ignorance, but of the variation within the real landscape out there. That's a point worth making, I think. So let's try and look at the how much uncertainty there is, what uncertainty there might be. So what if we looked at the area here? If we took the minimum and best, or maximum and best. Sorry, this is the densities. I'm sorry. So what if we take the lowest values that the expert give us, and the highest value that the expert give us? This is the variation you get. And so you see that actually accounts for a large proportion of variation. There's a large degree of variation that's associated with that. So I'm sorry that the print is small here, but for example, this is 40-30 here, European dry heaths, and 40-60 alpine and boreal heaths. So alpine and boreal heaths especially has a very large area in Europe. And so combined with the variation, uncertainty, whatever we want to call it, that the experts had about the grazing rate, we can have a very large difference in numbers. You compare that with Atlantic wet heaths, for example. So the variation in estimate is even greater. You see between the blue and the orange, but the area is relatively small, and so the effect on the total livestock numbers is not as large. Okay, I thought there was something else here. Okay, one thing I don't have in this diagram here is the meadow habitats. So the meadow habitats, first of all, we have this problem, especially in France, of having the very, very large difference in area estimates. But we also had a second and more fundamental issue, which that in some countries, for some of the habitats at least, the experts said, oh, okay, they only need mowing. And in some cases, they would go even further and say, well, actually, they need not to be grazed in order to maintain them at their best. And that applies to some extent to all 5 of the meadow habitats, the habitats with meadows in their names. So these are Molinia meadows, or wet meadows, the 2 alluvial meadows, floodplain meadows in continental Europe and in the north, and then the 2 hay meadows types, so the upland and the lowland. So we took what the expert says seriously, of course, but we did note that in some of the countries, quite a lot of these habitats are clearly not on hay meadows. So in Germany, for example, you can find former military ranges that have significant areas of meadow habitats that are clearly not being mown. And so the reality of their management compared to the ideal that the experts were telling us, the relationship was not always clear, I think. But on the other hand, we're not clear either to what extent they could be maintained in favourable conservation status by grazing only. So that's something that I think experts at the country level would need to look at again, I think, with our data to hand, and come to a determination themselves and feedback, I think. So we've done some multiplying up, and we can look at the estimates by member state, bearing in mind the range in habitat area and the range in estimates. And what we see is very much the picture that we saw for the habitats themselves, really. That the livestock need in Spain is vast, really, really, really large, over 2.5 million livestock units. And I think in Romania, some of these habitats are productive habitats in Romania, still surviving. So maybe we say that it's half what it is, but that figure needs to be revised. And similarly in Sweden, we know that there's this error to do with the mountain areas. But we have this, overall feel for it, and it's quite surprising actually that the range in the countries is not that huge, really, between the best and the worst. But that may hide, of course, weaknesses in the data themselves, which don't come out here. So this first diagram is just purely absolute numbers. And this second one is as a proportion of the livestock population they actually have. Now, that's not to say, of course, that the livestock population they actually have, that 40% of it in the case of Spain is grazing these areas, but it's just giving a proportion here, a ratio, so that we have some feel for it. And yeah, this is quite an interesting diagram, really, and there's of course a lot in it, because we not only have our estimates having a certain size, but the population of the livestock in the country having a certain size. So in Hungary, for example, it's a very arable country, and so the livestock population will be relatively small compared to the size of our estimate. That's why that would be so large. Yeah. So there's interesting stuff here, and if the figures were correct, you know, if we had huge faith in them and national experts had looked at them, then of course they have real political importance. So they have an implication for politics if we take the nature targets, the nature policy seriously. Yeah, so if we look at it from the habitat side, what I'm trying to do here is to break down the uncertainty that we have in the total number of livestock by the habitat. So which habitat are contributing most to the uncertainty? So we've excluded the meadow habitats here, okay? And what we find is it's the dry calcareous grasslands, the Festuca brometelia. They're the ones that have the largest uncertainty when we look at habitat extent. Okay. And then when it comes to the grazing need variation, and then we have a more mixed picture. So again, the dry grasslands are coming out here, the calcareous grasslands. But in this case, actually, it's the alpine and boreal heaths that's the biggest contributor. So you can see actually that you could focus your attention on improving the figures just on a relatively limited number of habitats, and you would improve the figures a lot because most of the uncertainty isn't scattered through the 61. It's in maybe half a dozen, 10, a dozen habitats. So improvement is possible by rather focused efforts, I would say. So just an overview of the estimations here. So the habitats, they're not uniform. There's a lot of variation in them. And what the experts told us reflects that variation. So some of this won't be improved by improving the general range figures we have. It'll be improved by looking at individual countries, looking to see what values would be most representative. So if the experts, for example, say, well, we could have our calcareous habitats, they could be from 0.05 maybe up to 0.5. Well, okay, what figure would be representative? Are most of them actually on thin soils and would be most towards the low end, or are most of them on deep soils and more likely to be at the top end? We don't have that information, and that's one way that the data could certainly be improved. As I said, the overall uncertainty in the totals anyway is focused on very few of the habitats. But when we add them up, even when we take all that uncertainty in, the range of totals that we can come to is still relatively modest compared to the total livestock in the whole EU, and in most cases to the total livestock in most member states. And so we're giving a good first estimate, I would say. And again, to make a political non-EA point here, if these habitats are important for policy, then these numbers are really important. The future of these livestock, the policies that support them, that are the integration of policy in a way that delivers this improvement in status. What's the word in the 30 by 30? Effective conservation management. Well, that all requires a great integration and non-silo thinking between policy areas. And so these figures are a key part of that. But what struck us when we were having these interviews is, first of all, that the experts found it a really interesting question. They really enjoyed, for the most part, I think, thinking about it. But we were the first ones to ask it. And when we asked it, people said, oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I never thought of that before. So that's a real problem, I think, that there's no impetus coming from the centres, seemingly, to be asking this kind of question. And if there's no impetus, then it's not surprising that policy won't work in a coherent way to support these places. So there are refinements possible, quite clearly. There's definitely room for improvement in some Article 17 reports. Probably in most of them when it comes to narrowing the range of estimates, but some of them have glaring problems that should be addressed quite clearly. Any values that come from us, especially, they need to be checked because, yeah, there will be definitely better information at the member state level. And perhaps we can narrow down the variation in the estimates by focusing on a certain number of habitats, really. This would seem quite a productive way forward. And perhaps both actually, to try and get values which are better representative values than the range and the rather random numbers that we chose in that range. And in the case of meadows, of course, there needs to be more thinking about that. Perhaps we need more livestock than we're thinking in some countries because of the meadows issue. So, to go back to the question, how many livestock do they need? Well, as I think you'll have got, the precision is low, but within a ballpark, it's really quite unambiguous. And the good answer, because it's not perfect, doesn't mean it's not good. So what we think is that there's between 7 and 10 million, so I would be saying probably between 8 and 9 million, in fact, livestock units are needed to maintain hallowed habitats, and that equates to, so it's not the livestock which are there, of course, but it equates to between a sixth and a ninth of the EU population of cattle, sheep and goats, basically, yeah? That's the rough proportion I'm talking about. So on the one hand, it's only a sixth or a ninth. So when we're talking about, the future of food policy and greenhouse gas emissions from livestock, okay, it's a modest proportion. So you could reduce, if you wanted to reduce livestock, you could reduce it a lot and still have plenty of room to have enough livestock to manage the habitats. But on the other hand, it is a sixth to a ninth. And we know from personal experience that these habitats are generally, as Henk said in the introduction, they're largely undermanaged, So it's not a matter of a few cattle here and a few horses there in a nature reserve. We're talking about millions of livestock units here. So I just thought I would, we'd talk about next steps and then give you just a brief insight into some other work that we did, just that is the kind of work that maybe is needed. So the obvious next step is to compare needs with actual use. What's actually happening out there? If we need, whatever it was, 2 million livestock units, or I can't remember the number now, but let's say 2 million livestock units in Spain to be grazing on semi-natural areas, how many livestock actually are grazing there? And of course, that's not to say that the perfect amount is grazing everywhere, but how many roughly are out there? And we know in some countries that the number is much lower than what's needed. We need to be thinking about the implications of these things, I think, for policy. Simple numbers, yeah, of course, but also the policy framework that can deliver these things. Or we need to change our policy. That's, of course, that's perfectly acceptable for a political entity to do, is to change the policy and say it's all unachievable, we can't do it. But we need to be explicit in that. It can't happen by accident, and that's what's happening now. It is happening almost by accident. And it has great spending implications, of course. And when we look at EU policy at the EU level, it's quite clear that some countries are very important. And it's quite clear also that some countries have real challenges. And so this, if 30 by 30 is to be achieved at the community level, that has some spending implications at the community level, probably, in the allocation of funds. Okay. So this is the very last slide. We've talked about the theory of it. We've tried to make calculations. We're the first ones to make these calculations, and they're not perfect, but they're good, I think. But what do we know about the actual situation? Do we know anything? Well, the first thing to say, of course, is that we have no direct information. No one is asking this question. But it's something we have been working on. So as Jan Erik said, there was previous rounds of this work, if I put it that way, with our colleagues in Wageningen and my colleague Hirgbartel. We did look at the use of semi-natural in reality in Europe. We tried to investigate that, and what we did was look at the use of various semi-natural Korean land cover classes by asking natural experts, and we asked them two things really. What proportion of this land cover class do you think is grazed in your country? And what is a good estimate for the density of animals that graze each of those classes? And in the same way as we did for Halliday, we could multiply those up and give some estimate, just an estimate, of the total number of livestock units which are actually using the semi-natural, at least in part. So again, we're not saying that the livestock are only on those areas. We're not saying there isn't some movement between them at the margins, but it's an estimate. And from those data, it seems like there's at least 5 million livestock units, which use at least for a part of the year the semi-natural classes. And that excludes pasture, which has, if you know Korean, it has certain issues. But some of pasture, at least, is semi-natural. And so there'll be some livestock more that we could add to that total if we knew the proportion of pasture which was semi-natural. But then on the other hand, of course, not all of semi-natural is Annex 1, and not all is certainly on the Halliday list of ones which need agriculture. So we have to make some adjustment there. And Korean isn't a detailed habitat map, of course. It has some, it works by generalization. And so if things are at a fine scale within something else, then you won't see it in Korean. So an example, for example, would be Estonian wooded meadows. You can't see them in Korean. They just stand out in a, they're not large enough in the landscape. And even if we have a really good picture of how many animals are out there on the Halliday habitats, of course, we know that some places will be undermanaged and some places will be overmanaged. And so this is really imperfect. And again, it's a dirty crossover, really. It's very difficult to make a one-to-one comparison. But the general picture, I think, is one which supports the feeling that we have as we travel across Europe, really. And that's the feeling that Henk mentioned at the start, which is really most of these habitats in large areas of the continent are undermanaged. This Korean work doesn't really prove that. It's very difficult to reflect back on the Halliday habitats. But this is the kind of work that really you would like to do, I think, for the Halliday habitats themselves as Halliday habitats, not having to go through the filter of Korean. Because again, to go back to the underlying point, really, these questions are important questions if we take these nature commitments seriously. And of course, even though they're nature commitments, they have really big implications in some member states, especially for the whole of the rural community and the rural economy and all these kind of things. And so our plea is, by all means, criticize the work we've done, but be inspired by it to do better. Because there's a lot of information that needs improving there. There's a lot of information that needs gathering for the first time. But it's doable, I think. I think the work we've done shows that good things can be done. And it's up to member states and the Commission to really take a bull by the horns and get doing it, I think. So yeah, thanks very much for your interest, and I'll bring it to an end there.
Thank you very much, Quinn. This is hugely interesting research you have done. And it shows also that there's so much work to do still, that you basically are just at the start of finding out how much grazing animals are needed, where the habitat types are actually located, and also the habitat types that are on the list but not managed at all. So there's really, in terms of research, but also in terms of policy work, a lot of work to do to get a more clear idea about how to protect the habitat types and how to get them in a favorable conservation status. And yeah, as you also indicated, not all the habitat types are designated as a Natura 2000 site. So it's not about only the sites into the Natura 2000 network, but also outside of the Natura 2000 network. So yeah, I found it very interesting. And again, as you said, it's the first step, and you have done an incredible amount of good work to bring what is available together and to present the best, well, the best knowledge we have in this field together and present that. So there are a number of questions, and somebody's asking whether the slides will be available. Yes, they will be available on the website of Eurosite, and maybe also you have a website, Gwyn. And so what can we say more about the questions? There's a very long question from Volkan Büyükgüner. Sorry, Volkan, my Turkish is not very good, but I lead a project in Anatolia that involves multiple grazed habitats, including serpentine steppes and Irano-Anatolian steppes. Project aims for habitat restoration and biodiversity loss offset through managed grazing in commons. We have experienced that experts are quite biased and polarized when it comes to putting animals on habitats depending on their past and present exposures to some widely varying policies on the subject. Do you have any means of minimizing this bias for your project? And would you have any suggestion to future projects? Well, that's a complicated question, maybe, Quinn, but can you say something about this?
Yes, thanks for the question. The point is a fair one, I think. But in general, well, we're not talking here about all the habitats that are grazed. So we're talking about that subset of habitats which are considered universally, maybe not universally, but yeah, there's a fair degree of consensus, I think, that they're the habitats that need grazing, in part at least. So there will be other habitats where there's no such consensus, or where it's thought that grazing is either, irrelevant or that grazing is damaging. Yeah. So we already had, the data was already split, if you want to put it that way. So we're not talking about areas where people are saying that grazing is really damaging, and we're talking about experts that would think that grazing has a certain role, at least, and so they would be of that mindset. But I'm sure you could find, actually in the UK and in Ireland and in other countries, people would say, oh no, we should just let it all go. But these would also, I think, be people who would say, well, maybe the Habitats Directive approach is wrong, actually. That, we shouldn't be thinking, we need to maintain this heathland feature. We should be allowing the heathland feature, if necessary, to disappear, or to become much less as it becomes this, woodland that we think is the best, end point for landscapes or whatever. So I'm not saying that this question that's raised isn't a real question out there, but the framing of it sort of excluded that kind of thinking, I think, because we're thinking within the terms of the Habitats Directive and with people who are experts in thinking in that same way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Quinn. There's an other question from Hebe Karus. And the question is related also to natural grazing. Some habitat, especially those sustained by low-density grazing, are maintained by wild herbivores, particularly in cases in Scotland with deer. But there are also other examples. In the past, in the Netherlands, we had still a lot of rabbits that were grazing on the heathlands, but we don't see them anymore. And there is indeed a relation with natural grazing and maybe even with rewilding. How do you look at that? Because the focus is really on the habitat types, but by the end of the day, it's also about the biodiversity related to the habitat types. So how do you look at this more approaching the management from a rewilding or a wild perspective?
Yes, another good question. Well, to step back, first of all, I think that Osterman and Haladan colleagues later, they also were asking this question. And so we know that there will be some habitats where livestock grazing is not necessary, for sure, and they won't be on the list. And it's also clear in the wording of their papers that the habitats only in part, it could be more than in part, of course, but that's what all they're claiming, is that habitats only in part need livestock grazing. And of course, I showed an example there in Sweden where it's quite clear that that's the case. And so I'm not. Our work doesn't say, I don't think, that this is the only way that the habitats could be maintained. But conversely, the reason that we're interested in our work and we're interested in these livestock systems is because when we look at areas in Spain or Bulgaria or Romania, whatever, where agriculture has declined, wild herbivores haven't filled the gap. So there is succession there. These habitats which need more intensive management, obviously intensive is the wrong word, but you know what I mean, of a certain type, they are disappearing and they are changing into other habitats. And of course, that's a matter for policy. If policy wants to say that's fine, that's fine. But in terms of what purely the management of those habitats, when we look at real examples, it seems to be showing change, and change which is leading to the loss of those habitats or the loss of their conservation status. So Jan Erik wants to say something.
Yes, Jan Erik, please go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I mean, didn't want to cut you off. It's actually a different point I wanted to bring in. However, on this one, fully concur with Wynn. We also need to consider what type of grazier you have. Most of the wild herbivores are actually browsers. And what we have lost is the grazers that we have in the domestic livestock. So we don't have our ox, we have a few bison. We don't really have wild sheep. And these are the grazers, and they have a different impact on the vegetation than the browsers that are deer. And so this explains maybe also why the wild herbivores don't prevent succession in many cases. But they can work together. It's just a question of how you mix it and how you can manage it. I would say, in addition to what Gwyn said when he said, systems have declined, it is important to work as hard as possible to maintain extensive grazing systems where they still exist, and to reintroduce them, because it's very difficult to do. And so this was one key reason why, in our more polite manner, we frame the question that agriculture policy and society has to decide on. Do we want to maintain these systems and by doing so have environmentally friendly and quality food production while maintaining biodiversity? and many of these systems are underrepresented in the farming bodies and in agriculture statistical systems, etc. So it's important that we pay attention to them. Even where they still exist, they are generally struggling. That's one point. The point because of which I raised my hand is that I see many interesting comments coming through. We still have time to reflect on them, but I also wanted to ask anyone who is interested in looking at our results in detail to notify maybe you at your site so that we get their contact details, because we will have a consultation phase, and we do know that we can improve the work that we have done, even though it's been an extensive exchange with the experts. We didn't just take their suggestions at face value. We challenged them. We tried to reflect together, and so hopefully we have a good approximation. But all of it can be improved, and we look forward to further input. Thank you.
Thank you. Gwyn, you would like to add to that, or is there something else you would like to say?
No, I'm busy typing answers to questions.
Yeah. Maybe then as a follow-up to what you said, Jan Erik, once the report is ready, I don't know whether there's a certain timeline. You're asking for feedback, and at some point it needs to be concluded, I guess. What will be the next steps? Is there kind of follow-up foreseen, either in terms of collecting more information or policy recommendations? What will be done after this is done, so to say?
So the first target we have is to polish off the presentation and some final representation of numbers, ideally this week or next, and to send it via our formal networks for review by the EU, by EU member states, but EEA member countries. And obviously to the Commission departments, DG Agriculture, DG Environment, that are interested. We hope to receive quite a bit of feedback during that phase. And it's in this phase, which is, I would expect to conclude by the end of April, that we have an opportunity to bring in others on an expert basis. It's a little tricky for me to suggest that maybe we expose it via the Eurosite channels. I mean, even though I very much respect Eurosite, but it's not our standard practice. So that's why I request that anyone who's interested provides maybe an indication of interest to us, because we can surely arrange another sort of expert panel-based review in addition to the formal channels. And so on the assumption that the consultation phase finishes at the end of April, then by the end of June, we would have a report available on the EEA biodiversity information page for nature restoration, which summarizes the outcome of the work in terms of all the details that Gwyn has mentioned. And in addition, we will also have a briefing, which is then a formal EEA publication, which sort of in a 7-8 page synthesis discusses the key issues and key results. And so that's the plan. And that should also ideally be out by the summer. But that's to be confirmed.
Okay, thanks a lot. So in case people would like to get more information or would like to report, they can also send us an indication that they are interested, or directly to the EEA, to Jan Erik. And anyway, we are happy to contribute further to improve the current data and the distribution of the data and collecting feedback and so on.
Thank you.
I see here a question of Bill Grayson. An additional 5 to 10 million livestock units would imply a lot of extra methane emissions that would threaten to compromise EU's climate targets. Have you considered how to reconcile this in policy terms?
May I answer, Gwen? These are not additional. They are the ones we should keep. We should get rid of the intensive ones that have the higher emissions, because the domestic livestock that over thousands of years have replaced the wild herbivores, cattle, etc., which also emit methane, don't add any methane. They just maintain the methane level that has always been linked to the herbivore population of the planet. So they are fairly climate neutral. And we need to reduce the others that are fed on silage maize, soy, etc., and that have increased our methane emissions linked to livestock production. So I think we think this is very compatible, both targets here in this regard. Thank you.
Amen.
Good.
Amen. But I know Bill knows the answer, of course. Bill also thinks that.
Right,
But I think Bill raises an interesting political question, doesn't he? I know, for example, in Scotland that I can't remember now. Is it some Star, isn't it? The one that where they take into account the decay of methane over the years. It's the Scottish government doesn't really want to use it, because if you were wanting a quick win, you could still reduce the number of livestock. It looks like a really quick win to get the figures down. So there's your question is a difficult one politically, I think, Bill, and it requires policies which are more than one-trick ponies, doesn't it? As well as policies that look at the real science. I would also think that. But yeah, no, it's not an easy thing at all, politically.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it with respect to the questions. Apart from Hannes Gamper, who asks which breeds, body sizes, age groups, and husbandry systems and breeding do we need? That's a difficult one. Can you?
I don't know if it's a difficult one, because as the Annex says, not in all places, but these things, they still survive to some extent. You know, there's these systems. I think the question is, how do we make these systems socially and economically, and by implication also politically viable? That's the question. The difficulty isn't that we don't know what livestock there is or what systems you could use, although of course there's room for, for innovation. So these no fence collars, for example, that's a recent thing that is a game changer potentially. But in general, we know how to do it. Really, it knows how it can be done, and it's not in a single way either. The point is that these places have survived mostly because they're economically marginal, and now people don't have to stay in economically marginal areas, and that's the real problem for these systems. And then the rewilding thing kind of builds onto that. So it's a sort of makes you feel happy about that if you believe in rewilding, But the real problem is a socioeconomic problem, really, and a political one that goes along with it.
Jan-Erik, you would like to add?
Yes, I wanted to reflect on really the type of animal that can graze different habitat types. And there's actually more flexibility than one might assume. Of course, there is sort of certain habitats that are maybe in very rocky places, or that are of very low productivity, or that are shrub where you need to be very hardy animal. that can only be managed with quite traditional and tough livestock breeds, but a cow is still a cow, whether it's Holstein Friesian or it's Galloway. So heifers, Holstein Friesian heifers, can very well manage an extensive grassland system in Germany. I've seen it myself.
Yeah.
It's just the type of farmer who can use biomass from semi-natural grazing is generally one that relies more on the tougher breeds that don't require as much management, and the dairy systems these days are so managed and intensive that, and so large, they don't have time nor experience maybe any longer to graze the heifers on the faraway pasture. But there is quite a lot of flexibility in terms of breeds moving around Europe. Galloway, Highland, Scottish Highlands being an example used all over the place. And as Gwyn said, there is really a lot of possibilities for crossbreeds with Hereford, etc., so that you have a decent sort of production opportunity that ties in with grazing these medium productive semi-natural systems. But it's a question that is worth exploring further. And of course, the larger the animal, the higher the trampling risks when you don't, when the grazing conditions are not optimal, there is a bit of wetness on the ground, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think I agree completely with you, Eric. There's differences, of course, between breeds, but a lot of it is the culture that the cow grows up in. You know, what the cow is used to doing, what the cow knows how to do, what the cow has learned from its mother, and what the cow has been taught by the farmer, also, of course, to some extent. But I would say that being a sort of farmer myself now, one thing that really has struck me much more since being a farmer, or being a grazing manager, is that the real problem is not the summer. You know, and having the right animals to graze the place in the, you know, as the Annex says, things can graze, yeah, a lot of things if they're used to it and they know about it. It's the winter is the problem, you know, and so where do you put your animals in winter, and who are you competing with in winter in terms of land use, in terms of resources, in terms of capital needs and all that sort of thing. That's the real problem. I don't know. Maybe Bill has some insights into this. Actually, he's done it a lot more than I've done it. But I would say that that's the we turn it around as ecologists or people interested in ecology. We turn it around. We focus on the grazing period and all that, and that's not really the problem, I don't think.
Okay, Bill is, I don't know, Sophia, if we can give Bill access to the microphone if he would like to add something. But he says that in the Burren, grazing regime is centered around winter.
It is, but I mean, I think he would also agree that the Burren, because it's limestone and because it's dry and warm, and you have the standing hay there, it's really different from most places in the continental and boreal and Atlantic anyway. Maybe in the Mediterranean, of course, then it's the problem is the summer. But it's the same problem, really.
Yeah. All right. The last question that is from.
Sorry, Henk. Bill is available to.
Okay, Bill.
Yes.
Would you like to add something?
Just to follow up on that point about if you have access to some habitats within a specific region, and you think carefully about how the grazing can be organized amongst a suite of different habitats, then there's much more possibility for integrating this sort of seasonal change model into something that can work really well for nature. And as Gwyn said, that's been the basis for what we do with limestone habitats on the edge of the Lake District in England.
May I ask, Bill, is it dairy farming, or is it for meat production?
No, it's suckler beef, so it's a fully integrated system where all the calves born on the holding are finished, despite the land being, of marginal quality mostly. It just needs more time. But that's fine, because the longer they take, the better equipped they are to deal with these marginal habitats.
Yeah, but it makes a difference whether it's dairy farming, which is requires much more labor and so on, than if you are holding the cattle for beef.
Sure, yeah.
So,
well, as Eric says, certainly in the UK, the traditional dairy systems, okay, there were some that were transhumancing to the uplands and with the women going to milk them. But for a large part, dry cows and young stock were using these semi-natural pastures, even in what we would think of as fairly intensive systems in the old style,
There's a really nice example of that not far from here, Gwyn, in the Yorkshire Dales, because every summer the dry cows and the heifers, the bulling heifers, would go up onto the limestone at Ingleborough and the Yorkshire Dales, and that lasted well into the 1960s, and then it, because of intensification, it eventually failed, and all those cattle were lost and replaced by sheep.
I think also, to make a wider point, Hank, that these kind of discussions we're having now, they're largely absent from the way agri-environment policy works, for example. The kind of movements that Bill is talking about, perhaps one of the big challenges them is TB regulations.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the wintering cost of the cow might be the real system breaker, So things like that, this holistic view of things, is missing from the whole of policy, really. Whether it's between nature and agriculture, or whether it's between so-called nature policy, agri-environment policy, this holistic thing is really quite missing.
But that takes us back to the Burren as an example, because for generations, farmers were transporting cattle from the other side of the country just to winter on those areas.
Yeah. Okay, Bill, Gwyn, I'm trying to close this part of the discussion. There's one question left, which I find interesting, and then we close the webinar. That's from Pernilla Borgström, I guess from Sweden. And she's asking on a follow-up of an earlier question, how to use existing livestock units better or more for grazing semi-natural grasslands. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on which incentives would be needed, political, economical, or others, in order to make farmers choose to let their livestock units graze in semi-natural grasslands. Well, basically also what we discussed already, but maybe you can answer this question, Gwyn.
Oh, it's a big question for the last 3 minutes, isn't it? Well, I don't know. Should I have a Swedish answer? I mean, in Sweden, there's a number of ranges of that question, isn't there? There's the question within the farm scale, or the slightly bigger than the farm scale, where there's areas of semi-natural still surviving within the arable rotation or whatever, and how to make them part of your system. But then there's also a wider scale, isn't there, where cattle used to move to the fairbird or whatever, or where there's whole, parts of the countryside where there used to be forest grazing or whatever, and whether that kind of thing can ever be brought back. I don't know. It's too big a question for this stage of the event, I think.
Okay. Maybe we need to follow up, because that's absolutely an interesting question. I mean, the current trend is just the other way. More and more of these habitat types are being abandoned. There's no management anymore. Farmers are leaving the countryside, and what is left is high intensive agriculture. And despite all the agri-environment measures and policies, we apparently don't manage to turn the tide.
We
So
have
that's-
the EU now works through strategy, doesn't it? The strategic plan.
Mhm.
And where are these questions being addressed, or being asked, or being set out in the strategic plans, which are meant to be the integration of all these policies? They're not, basically. So
Okay.
how to change that, I really have no idea.
Jan-Erik, you have the last word.
Yeah, thank you. Just on this point, as I mentioned, we will release this report for review into the IUNET group on nature restoration. And the nature restoration regulation requires the member states to draw up national restoration plans to achieve the targets in the regulation itself, which basically replicate many of the targets under the Birds and Habitats directives. So precisely how much grazing do you need to establish should be one of the points they should be discussing. So I can just encourage everyone to ask, if you have any opportunity to influence national authorities, to ask them to address this issue in their restoration plans. And thank you for all the interesting questions and comments. It was nice to see your engagement. Thank you.
Thank you also, and thank you to all the participants and for the questions asked. I found it a very interesting discussion and information provided. So hopefully we can follow up this at some point. Once again, thank you, especially Jan-Erik and Quinn, and all the best.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Hank.
much.
Thank you all.
Good day. Bye-bye.